Evolutionary biology, like many disciplines in science, has several overarching goals and aims. The first is to reconstruct the ancestor-descendant relationship of all life. And you probably recognize this tree from 9a. We call these ancestor relationship graphics a phylogeny of organismal relationships. And it's important to understand that a phylogeny is a hypothesis of lineage evolution because, of course, we can't go back in time and watch how organisms have evolved over tens of millions of years. We have to use data in the form of homologous characters and synapomorphies to reconstruct these phylogenies. And if those terms don't make a ton of sense to you, we're going to go over them again during this course. This is a huge aim of evolutionary biology, and one place where you can kind of explore the progress of this tree of life is on the Tree of Life web project, the URL which is posted at the top here. This is basically the tree of all known organisms that is being compiled online, and it's kind of fun. You can go ahead and enter the name of your favorite organism right here. Maybe it's a dog or a dogfish, or if you're like me, it's a snake or a spider. And you can click on it and kind of explore what organisms it's closely related to, its ancestors, how long the lineage has been around, how many species there are. It's kind of a fun site to tool around with. Now, it is interesting to understand the relationships of all organisms that have ever lived, but there's another really important reason why phylogenies are critical, and that is that we use them in answering questions of goal number 2. And goal number 2 is to determine the origins of key traits and innovations during the evolution of various taxa. So you might be interested, for instance, in understanding the evolution of beak size and diet in these birds here. And these are Hawaiian honeycreepers. It's an interesting group of birds that has evolved in the Hawaiian Islands. And what you see is that there is an incredible diversity of beak shapes and sizes. So we have beaks that are sickle-shaped, like this beak up here, and this beak here, and these beaks down here. And we have rather robust beaks here that might be used for crushing seeds, and we have finer beaks here that might be used for grabbing insects. So we have all these different bills. And we can ask questions about the evolution of these beaks or bills. For instance, at what point did sickle-shaped bills evolve in this lineage? Now, if you don't understand the relationships among these different organisms, if you don't have a hypothesis of lineage evolution or a phylogeny, this is an impossible question to answer because you need to know something about the history of these organisms. In other words, what came first, long bills or short bills? Well, there are several hypotheses we can put forth. And again, these are hypotheses based on data, but that's all they are. We can't go back in time and watch definitively how these bills evolved. So here's one possibility. Maybe the ancestor to every one of these birds had a long bill. If that's the case, we would expect these two birds down here to have long bills and everyone else to have long bills. But of course, we have short bills in this lineage and we have short bills in this lineage. So in these two lineages, at least, they must have gone from being long-billed to being short-billed. Here's another hypothesis. Maybe the ancestor to all of these birds was a short-billed bird. This would then require the separate evolution of two long-billed lineages, one down here early on and one up here later on. But without a phylogeny, we can't answer questions about the origins of key traits and innovations during the evolution of different groups of organisms. Now let's go back. We started by saying these birds all live on the Hawaiian Islands, and they all have these different bills and bill shapes. And you might then ask the question, well, why do they have different bill shapes? What's the point of having different bill shapes? And of course, bills or beaks are tools. They're tools for getting food, and you need the right tool for the right job. So long sickle-shaped bills might be used for getting nectar, the small thin bills for grabbing insects, the robust bills for cracking seeds. And this leads to the third important goal and aim of evolutionary biology, and that is to understand which processes generate and maintain diverse species and adaptations. The word you might be familiar with for diverse species and adaptations is biodiversity. It's a measure for how many different species there are and how many different forms and shapes there are. So we can ask, what processes lead to different bill shapes in those Hawaiian honey creepers? Or, looking at these beetles, what mechanisms generate and maintain such crazy beetle diversity? Okay. Since the beginning of Western science, the growth of knowledge, whether it's trying to answer these main questions in evolutionary biology, or astronomy, or physics, the growth of knowledge requires specialization and refinement. Because as our body of knowledge grows larger, we need to sort of pick at smaller and smaller things to push the boundaries of what we know. For instance, if you were a biologist 300 years ago, it was enough to simply find a new organism and say, well, this is an animal and it's not a plant. But of course, as we started to figure out differences between animals and plants, that wasn't good enough. So maybe you would have to say, well, this new animal is not only an animal, but it's also a mammal because it has some mammalian creatures. And we know that there are different types of animals. And so we keep going in that fashion. We keep learning more and increasing the amount of knowledge of humankind. In order for us to do that, there had better be some sort of process by which we can push those boundaries. And it turns out that there is. Surprise, surprise, it's science. Science. Now, science is one of these terms that we all kind of know, but we don't really know. Here's what I mean by this. When I wrote this lecture, or a version of this lecture for a different course, I started to write the next slide, which is a definition of science, and I just started to type. Science is the process by which, science is the method within which, no, and then I realized I have no idea what the definition of science is. And I'm a scientist, I have a PhD, I should know this, right? So I went to the web, and here's what I found. Two definitions. I really like the second definition. The second definition says that science is systematic knowledge of the physical or material world gained through observation and experimentation. Well, we already talked about observation. That's the really, really important part of natural history. And experimentation is a really, really important part of answering those proximate questions, the how questions. This word systematic that you see means something that is done or acting according to a fixed plan or system. It's methodical. And so what this means is that there must be a set of principles or guidelines by which science is conducted regardless of which field you're interested in looking at. And it turns out that there is, but we will investigate that in our next mini video.